The measles outbreak is growing in Texas. The state's health department now reports 159 cases, and that includes 13 new cases in just the past 5 days. ABC's Phil Lippoff following the latest on that for us. So, Phil, what's being done to contain this?
All right, so the CDC says they have sent this rapid response team in to help, and newly appointed and confirmed HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who you know has shown skepticism, to say the very least, about vaccines, including the MMR vaccine that prevents measles, has said that he wants to be transparent about how they're handling this. They sent this team in, and he says they've treated 108 patients with a steroid, with an antibiotic, with vitamins A and D. He's stopped short, though, of recommending that everybody be vaccinated.
What about cases outside of Texas?
So what we're tracking is 164 cases in 8 states this year. The states are Alaska, California, Georgia, New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, New Mexico. It's not an abnormal thing to see sporadic cases throughout the country. It's, a herd immunity issue. You're supposed to have your first vaccine, your first dose of the vaccine when you're an infant, the second dose by the time you're 4 to 6, and then you're 93% covered. The problem with what we're seeing in most of these cases, I think it's 90-something% of these cases are unvaccinated, or those we don't know their vaccination status.
All right, Phil Lippoff, thank you.
In Greece, the 2023 railway disaster has become a bit of a flashpoint of widespread protests. On Wednesday, thousands came out onto the streets of Athens, demanding accountability from the politicians. The demonstrations quickly spiraled into clashes with the police. The protesters gathered outside of the parliament as the lawmakers debated a censure motion against the government. The censure motion, tabled by the opposition parties, registered some pretty strong disapproval against the ruling parties for their handling of the 2023 rail tragedy that killed about 57 people. Now, the opposition lawmakers accused the government of failing to address their safety gaps and also to cover up evidence instead of taking responsibility. Outside of the parliament, the protesters echoed a similar sentiment as the demonstrations quickly turned volatile. The police tried to disperse the thousands that had gathered in the Greek capital. And the police also fired tear gas and arrested several protesters, even as many continued to chant and demonstrate.
I think we should be here every day until we see some kind of change. We don't want our politicians mocking us every day, because that's what we're feeling, that we're being mocked, that there is no justice.
The preliminary investigations and whatever is being discussed should conclude that someone must be held accountable, criminally accountable, not just the driver, the last link in the chain. Politicians and ministers bear responsibility, including Mitsotakis himself.
The protest started in Greece last week after citizens gathered to commemorate the second anniversary of the tragedy and demand justice for the victims who died in Greece's worst rail tragedy in history. The lawmakers will vote on the censure motion on Friday. However, the government is expected to survive the vote, given that the ruling party has 156 seats in the 300-member parliament.
I have no ill feelings toward the Speaker, none toward the persons that escorted me away from the floor, because I did disrupt. And I did so because the President indicated that he had a mandate. And I wanted him to know that he didn't have a mandate to cut Medicaid. I did this because Medicaid is the only insurance many people have in this country. I am blessed. As I stand here now, there's a physician waiting. If something should happen, I will be taken to that physician. I have the best health care in the world. There are other people who have less than I. I would have them have what I have. But I surely will not stand by and see them lose what little they do have. But if circumstances permit it, given what I know, I have to be candid. I would do it again. I would do it because I care about these people on Medicaid.
Well, the Trump administration, meantime, has broken its silence on Chinese warships circumnavigating Australia.
Let's head live to US correspondent Jonathan Kersley with those details. Jono, this is the first time the US has addressed the issue.
It is. It's my understanding that very senior Trump cabinet members are fully aware of the activities of China's PLA around Australia over the course of the last couple of weeks. Those ships have been essentially circumnavigating Australia, going further south than they've ever gone before, carrying out live firing drills, and even going past Western Australia, near to where a US Virginia-class submarine is docked, the USS Minnesota. I've been in talks with the White House about this issue and have spoken with a US defence official who has told me the following. We are aware of these activities and are closely monitoring. As Secretary Hegseth has said, China is a peer competitor with the capability and intent to threaten our core national interests in the Indo-Pacific, and the department prioritises deterring China. How it's going about deterring China in this instance and what it's doing to monitor those vessels, well, they have not said. But this whole incident raises a very significant question. What is President Xi Jinping's intention? Is he trying to send a message to the American president, whose foreign policy attention has been so heavily focused on Ukraine and Russia and on the Middle East too? Economically, Donald Trump has slapped further tariffs on China, and that has incensed Beijing. We've heard from the Chinese embassy here in the United States of America that has said if war is what the US wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we're ready to fight to the end. A sign of the seriousness and the tense relationship between the world's two biggest superpowers.
For Mexico, sir, the previous one.
Same thing for Mexico. One for Canada, one for Mexico.
Yes, sir.
They've been in the news lately, haven't they? And I spoke to the president of Mexico, wonderful woman, today, and we helped them out with the problem they were having to do with the tariffs, short-term tariffs. And we had a very good conversation. Also, we discussed drugs, and they've been working much harder lately. Do you notice that? On people coming in and drugs, and we've made tremendous progress on both.
Some of these exemptions that have been announced and some of these temporary delays, have you been influenced in those decisions because of the market reaction?
Well, there are no delays at all. No, nothing to do with the market. I'm not even looking at the market because long term, the United States will be very strong with what's happening here. Now, these are countries and companies, foreign companies, that have been ripping us off, and no president did anything about it until I came along, and then I did a lot about it.
Steel and aluminum tariffs are due to kick in next week on Canada, Mexico, and every other country. Are those going to be modified as well?
No, those aren't modified. Those are happening next week, and the big one will be on April 2nd when reciprocal tariffs.
Bien. ¿Ustedes? Bueno, este es en inglés. Fuimos tratados con mucho respeto. Digo fuimos, porque sí es a la presidenta de México, pero es al pueblo de México, porque yo represento al pueblo de México. Que todo lo planteamos siempre en este mes y siempre lo vamos a plantear por convicción, que se puede colaborar, coordinarnos, hacer muchas cosas juntos, siempre en el marco de respeto a nuestra soberanía, que es la posición que siempre hemos planteado. Entonces, realmente, por eso la publicación dice gracias al presidente Trump, porque México fue tratado con mucho respeto y pues llegamos a este acuerdo que realmente beneficia a ambas naciones.
En México, con la conectividad satelital.
El 2 de abril va a estar todo el mundo en la misma circunstancia, entonces el objetivo pues es que México, al no cobrar aranceles a Estados Unidos, pues la relación recíproca es, pues ellos tampoco nos cobran aranceles, ¿no? De todas maneras se sigue trabajando conjuntamente, es decir, se respeta el tratado comercial México, Estados Unidos, Canadá.
En México, sino también.
It is clear to most Americans that the person who is running the United States government now is Mr. Musk. And what we just tried to do is to subpoena Mr. Musk before the Health Education Labor Committee so that he can tell us why he is busy firing 80,000 employees of the Veterans Administration, half of the people who work at Social Security and agencies across the government. The American people need an explanation, and it's disappointing to me that the chairman refused to allow a vote on this.
Senator, today the president's expected to sign an executive order basically trying to dismantle the Department of Education, depending obviously oversee. Just your thoughts. Well,
It will be a disaster for working class families all over this country. It will mean higher property taxes. There are programs in the Department of Education which provide substantial amounts of help to low-income and working class communities where it is hard, where the tax base is very, very low. Through the Department of Education, kids with disabilities, and there are millions of them in America, get the help that they need. So I think what we need to do is take a good look at where there is bureaucracy, where there is waste. Let's go after it. Nobody does not want to do that. But just taking a chainsaw and dismantling programs which will hurt millions and millions of working class people is just not acceptable.
What are you hoping to hear from the FDA nominee today?
Not much, because he's not going to be running the FDA. It's Mr. Musk.
Today with your cabinet members and Elon Musk.
I did.
What did you tell them in regards to Elon Musk and his authorities to carry out actions?
We had a great meeting. We had Elon and we had some of the representatives for the business reps. We also had most of the cabinet members, not all of them. It doesn't really pertain to all of them, but many of them. And I thought it was a really good meeting. It was about cutting because everybody knows the country's way out of control in terms of the number of people. But the other thing I think most important for today, I want the cabinet members to keep good people. I don't want to see a big cut where a lot of good people are cut. I want the cabinet members to keep the good people, and the people that aren't doing a good job, that are unreliable, don't show up to work, etc., those people can be cut. So I had a meeting and I said, I want the cabinet members go first, keep all the people you want, everybody that you need. And it would be better if they were there for 2 years instead of 2 weeks, because in 2 years they'll know the people better. But I want them to do the best job they can. When we have good people, that's precious, that's very important, and we want them to keep the good people. And so we're going to be watching them, and Elon and the group are going to be watching them. And if they can cut, it's better. And if they don't cut, then Elon will do the cutting.
Welcome back. The European leaders are holding an emergency summit today as they scramble to increase their military budgets and bolster aid to Ukraine amid concerns about waning support from the U.S. President Zelensky received a warm welcome by EU leaders at that summit, in stark contrast to the tense meeting in the Oval Office last week. While European leaders huddle, President Trump warned that the U.S. might not defend NATO countries who do not meet the defense spending threshold.
If you're not going to pay, we're not going to defend. I said that 7 years ago. And because of that, they paid hundreds of billions of dollars. I said, if you're not going to pay your bills, we're not going to defend you.
Are you going to make that policy, U.S. policy, that the U.S. wouldn't defend NATO countries that don't pay?
Well, I think it's common sense, right? If they don't pay, I'm not going to defend them. No, I'm not going to defend them. I got into a lot of heat when I said that. You said, oh, he's violating NATO. And, the biggest problem I have with NATO, I really, I know the guys very well. They're friends of mine. But if the United States was in trouble and we called them, we said, we got a problem, France, we got a problem, a couple of others I won't mention. Do you think they're going to come and protect us? They're supposed to. I'm not so sure.
So why stay in NATO at all?
I view NATO as potentially good, but you gotta get some good thinking in NATO. It's very unfair what's been happening.
Meanwhile, NBC News is exclusively reporting that as the Trump administration appears to turn towards Russia, some U.S. allies are now thinking about scaling back the intelligence they share with the U.S. Joining me now is NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube, who reported on both of those stories. Courtney, congratulations on two great scoops. Let's start with NATO and this potential policy shift by the Trump administration. What does it mean for Article 5, which basically says an attack against one is an attack against all?
Well, what we were reporting is basically what President Trump just confirmed in the Oval Office, and that is that the Trump administration has been considering sort of calibrating their support for NATO and NATO allies based off of the members who pay the most. So if you have a member who pays above the threshold, the percent of their GDP on defense that the Trump administration thinks is appropriate, then they would consider defending them in the case of an Article 5 violation, or of course the part of the Washington Treaty that says if one NATO member is attacked, all consider themselves to have been attacked. But it's not just Article 5 that's under consideration here, Kristen. This potential decrease in support to NATO by the United States could also see the Trump administration basically calibrating which exercises, military exercises, they would participate in based off whether the countries are meeting this threshold, this monetary threshold. And it could also determine where U.S. military troops will be stationed and where they could be withdrawn from. So right now, NATO says that all members are supposed to pay 2% of their GDP towards defense. The Trump administration has been calling now for several weeks for that to be increased to 5%. Kristen, I have to say the U.S. doesn't pay 5%. We're right around 3.9% as of 2024.
Yeah, I think it's so important to point that out, that the United States doesn't pay 5%. Courtney, how extraordinary that he, and I think we have to put a fine point on this, confirmed your reporting from earlier in the day, and just notable to hear him talk about that. You also have exclusive reporting about allies possibly scaling back intelligence sharing with the United States. What are the biggest concerns that you're hearing on the world stage?
Yeah, and Kristen, again, these are some of the historically closest United States allies who have established this group called the Five Eyes. It's 5 nations that share this very highly classified technical intelligence information with one another at higher levels than they share intelligence with other nations. Now, some of these allies are now concerned that the United States seems to be trying to normalize relations with Russia. President Trump has spoken pretty openly about that effort. Because of that, they are concerned now about sharing some of that most sensitive information with the United States. And really at issue here, Kristen, is the foreign assets. They are concerned that some of their foreign assets, individuals, could potentially be compromised, their identities. And that is why they are now discussing the possibility of not sharing as openly as they have with the United States in the past.
All right, Courtney Kube, thank you so much. We really appreciate your report.
Russia has firmly rejected proposals for a temporary ceasefire in Ukraine. Moscow is dismissing suggestions of a 1-month halt in fighting or a cessation of aerial and naval attacks. Now, these ideas were floated by Ukraine, France and Britain. Now, Russia says that firm agreements on a final settlement are needed. Without all that, some kind of respite is absolutely unacceptable. Russia has also accused the French President Emmanuel Macron of spreading false narratives after he called for increased defense spending to counter potential Russian expansion into Europe. The Moscow has criticized Macron for ignoring Russia's legitimate security interests and has claimed a peaceful settlement is possible without considering the security of both Russia and Europe.
Macron's speech yesterday was a set of false narratives. I do not even know whether there are any words of truth there. He talked about ensuring guarantees for Ukraine's security. He did not say a word about the fact that a peaceful settlement is impossible without taking into account the legitimate security interests of both Russia and the whole of Europe, without any sort of division.
Now, all this has come at a very critical moment as European leaders gather in Brussels for urgent consultations on the conflict's future. Volodymyr Zelensky thanked EU leaders for standing by Ukraine's side as the bloc held crisis talks on confronting US President Donald Trump's pivot away from Kiev and also its transatlantic partners. British officials say that they've held talks with around 20 countries interested in being part of a coalition of the willing to support Ukraine during a ceasefire.
Great that we are not alone. We feel it and we know it. Thank you so much for everything, and signals to increase our production and signals to, with the new program, to increase the European security. That's, I think, the great decisions.
Now, Zelensky's visit to Brussels comes as he's scrambling to re-engage Washington after the Oval Office debacle, now declaring himself ready to work towards a peace deal under Trump's strong leadership and to finalize an accord on U.S. access to Ukrainian mineral resources. On Tuesday, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had also proposed a new framework for a partial ceasefire with Russia. In a post on X, he said that Kiev would be willing to release prisoners and to agree to a truce that would ban long-range attacks on civilian and energy infrastructure. Now, the offer came after the Trump administration declared that Zelensky was not ready for peace and froze the U.S. military assistance that Ukraine had been relying on to battle the Russian invasion.
Notre dissuasion nucléaire nous protège. Elle est complète, souveraine, française de bout en bout. Elle a, depuis 1964, de manière explicite, toujours joué un rôle dans la préservation de la paix et de la sécurité en Europe. Mais répondant à l'appel historique du futur chancelier allemand, j'ai décidé d'ouvrir le débat stratégique sur la protection par notre dissuasion de nos alliés du continent européen. Quoi qu'il arrive, la décision a toujours été et restera entre les mains du président de la République.
Еще со времен Наполеона, с нашествия Наполеона. До сих пор кому-то не имется. Есть еще люди, которые хотят вернуться к временам Наполеона, забывают, чем это закончилось.
Конечно, это угроза в адрес России. Если он нас считает угрозой, собирает встречу начальников генеральных штабов европейских стран и Британии, говорит, что необходимо использовать ядерное оружие, готовиться к использованию ядерного оружия против России, это, конечно же, угроза. В отличие от своих предшественников, которые тоже хотели против России воевать, Наполеона, Гитлера, господин Макрон не очень изящно поступает, потому что те прямо говорили, надо завоевать Россию, надо Россию победить. Он, видимо, хочет того же самого, но почему-то говорит, что воевать с Россией надо, чтобы она не победила Францию, что Россия создает угрозы Франции и Европе.
Wir sind in der NATO miteinander verbündet. Dazu gibt es ganz konkrete Regeln und dazu ist insbesondere wichtig, was wir haben an nuklearer Teilhabe, die in Deutschland organisiert ist. Und ich glaube, das soll nicht aufgegeben werden, ist die gemeinsame Auffassung aller zentralen Parteien in Deutschland.
I think it's a very interesting idea, and we see to this proposal with high expectations because, you know, nuclear umbrella would serve as really very serious deterrence towards Russia. And it is very important to use this opportunity, all opportunities to increase our resilience, and especially in the eastern flank, because eastern flank is exposed to different kind of threats.